The year is 1871. The air in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, hung thick with a promise of dust and opportunity. For Elias Thorne, a man hardened by years of tilling unforgiving soil, that promise was a siren's call. He clutched the faded deed in his calloused hand, its official seal a testament to a new beginning. The land, a generous grant from the newly chartered railroad, was a 2-day journey west, nestled in a valley whispered to be untouched and rich. It was a chance to escape the failures of his past, the haunting silence of a small, empty house, and the judgmental whispers that followed him like shadows. "Are you sure about this, Elias?" Sarah, his sister, a woman whose face was a map of worry lines and unspoken grief, asked as she packed the last of their meager belongings onto the wagon. Her hands trembled as she secured the canvas tarp. "It's fertile land, Sarah," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "The deed says so. We can build something there. A home. A life." He didn't mention the whispers he'd heard in the tavern, the strange looks from the locals when he spoke of the valley. A few men had simply shaken their heads, muttering about a place better left alone. One old trapper, his eyes the color of iced-over mud, had even gripped his arm, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Don't go to that valley, boy. Some places, they don't want to be settled." Elias had dismissed it as the ramblings of a drunkard. He was a man of logic, of hard work, not of ghosts and folklore. The lure of the land was too strong to be dissuaded by superstition. The journey was long and arduous. The sun beat down on their backs, and the wagon wheels groaned with every rut and stone. The landscape slowly transformed from the familiar rolling hills of Cedar Rapids to a wilder, more untamed terrain. Towering pines and gnarled oaks cast long, eerie shadows across the trail. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the creak of the wagon and the huff of their weary horses. On the third day, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in a bruised palette of purple and orange, they saw it. A clearing, carved out of the wilderness, and in its center, the beginnings of a settlement. There were a handful of log cabins, a makeshift general store, and what looked like a town hall under construction. But there was no church. Elias noticed this immediately. Every settlement, no matter how small, had a church, a place of worship, a symbol of community and faith. Its absence was a stark, unsettling detail. As they drew closer, a man emerged from the largest cabin, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a weathered face and eyes that held a strange, watchful intensity. He was accompanied by a woman with a kind but tired face, and 2 silent children who watched them with an unsettling stillness. "Welcome," the man said, his voice surprisingly soft. "I'm Silas Cooper, and this is my wife Martha and our children Caleb and Grace." Elias introduced himself and Sarah. Silas's gaze lingered on Elias's face for a moment too long. "You're the new settler," he stated, not asked. "The deed holder. We've been expecting you." "Expecting us?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with trepidation. "Word travels," Silas replied, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his lips. "We're a close-knit community here. We all look out for one another." Silas helped them unload the wagon, his movements efficient and strong. He led them to a small, empty cabin on the edge of the clearing. It was basic, with a single room and a hearth, but it was a home. Elias felt a surge of hope. This was it, the start of their new life. That evening, as they sat by the fire, a strange quiet descended upon the settlement. The sounds of the wilderness seemed to recede, replaced by a profound, almost oppressive silence. The town seemed to hold its breath. Elias looked out the small, grimy window. A faint, reddish light flickered in the distance, somewhere near the forest's edge. He squinted, trying to make it out, but it was too far away. "What's that light?" Elias asked Silas, who had brought them a bowl of thick stew. Silas's face was unreadable. Just the others, tending to things. Elias didn't press the issue. He was tired, and the stew was warm and nourishing. Sarah, however, seemed more uneasy. She kept glancing at the door, her eyes wide with an unnameable fear. "Elias," she whispered when Silas was gone, "did you see their eyes? They were empty, like they're looking through us, not at us." Elias dismissed her concerns. "They're just tired, Sarah. It's a hard life out here." But as he lay in the dark, the fire in the hearth casting dancing shadows on the walls, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air crept into his bones. He couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't just found a new home. He had walked into a place that was already and deeply occupied. The silence of the town was not peaceful. It was a hungry, watchful quiet. The missing church was no longer just an oddity. It was a signal, a silent, terrifying message he was only now beginning to understand. Please subscribe to our channel for the next chapter of this chilling story. Every week, a new chapter will be released, delving deeper into the unsettling secrets of this macabre town. Don't miss out on what happens next. The first few weeks were a blur of hard work and an unsettling sense of observation. Elias and Sarah worked from sunrise to sunset, clearing their plot of land, felling trees, and beginning the arduous process of building their permanent home. The townspeople were helpful, if not overly friendly. They would arrive unannounced, offering tools or a pair of strong hands, their assistance always accompanied by that same silent, watchful intensity. They never spoke much, and their conversations were always brief, focused solely on the task at hand. Elias had a few conversations with Silas, the town's de facto leader. Silas was a man of few words, but he spoke of the town's history with a detached reverence. "We believe in a different kind of faith here," he had said one afternoon, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We don't pray for blessings. We earn them, through devotion to the land and to each other." Elias didn't quite understand, but he was too busy and too hopeful to question it. He wanted to believe in this new life. He wanted to believe that the strange quiet of the town was simply the sound of people who were self-reliant and hard-working. The day of the Harvest Festival was announced with a simple notice nailed to the town hall. "All are welcome. The bounty of the land will be shared, and the new guests will be honored." The last part made a knot form in Elias's stomach. The new guests. He and Sarah. The festival was held at dusk. A long table was set up in the center of the clearing, laden with roasted meats, steaming vegetables, and freshly baked bread. A bonfire roared nearby, its light casting long, dancing shadows. The townspeople, all of them dressed in somber, dark clothing, sat in a large circle, their faces illuminated by the firelight. The only ones who seemed to show any signs of joy were the children, who chased each other through the shadows with a strange, silent glee. As the sun disappeared, a lone figure approached the clearing. A traveler. He was a young man, perhaps no older than 20, dressed in the tattered clothes of a prospector. He looked exhausted, his face gaunt with hunger. The townspeople watched him, their silence broken only by the crackle of the fire. "Evening, folks," the prospector said, his voice raspy. "Didn't expect to find a town out here. Was hoping for a place to rest my head and get a bite to eat." Silas rose from his seat, his imposing figure casting a long shadow. "You're welcome here, stranger," he said, his voice a low, melodic hum. "We have a feast. Come, join us." The prospector's face lit up with relief. He was a man of the world, full of stories of his travels and the gold he was chasing. He talked and laughed, his energy a stark contrast to the quiet stillness of the townspeople. He was a bright, vibrant splash of color in a world of muted tones. Elias and Sarah watched him, a strange relief washing over them. Finally, someone who seemed normal. After the meal, Silas stood, He raised a cup filled with a dark, bitter liquid that everyone else was drinking. "To the land," he said, "for the bounty it provides." The townspeople raised their cups, their silent faces reflected in the flickering firelight. Then Silas turned to the prospector. "And to our honored guest," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "May he be a vessel for the land's continued prosperity." A chill ran down Elias's spine. The prospector seemed to falter, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, but he raised his own cup and drank. The evening wore on. The air grew colder. The prospector, who had seemed so full of life, began to grow quiet. He stumbled, his laughter dying in his throat. His eyes, once so bright, became distant, unfocused. Elias saw a flash of fear in them before the man collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing. The townspeople watched with the same unblinking stillness. Elias, horrified, started to move forward, but Sarah grabbed his arm, her grip like a vice. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just don't." Silas knelt beside the fallen man. "The land demands its due," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Yet it carried through the unnerving silence. "We give it what it needs to prosper." The others began to hum, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to thrum with the beat of the earth. They lifted the prospector's limp body and carried him towards the dense woods where the flickering red light had been seen. Elias and Sarah watched in silent terror as the procession disappeared into the darkness. Elias's mind raced. He had come here for a new life, a fertile land. He had believed in hard work and the promise of a fresh start. But he had been blind. He had ignored the missing church, the unsettling silence, and the empty eyes of the townspeople. They weren't just settlers, they were something else. They were part of a terrifying, macabre ritual. And the prospector wasn't the first guest they had welcomed. As he lay in the dark that night, the hum of the townspeople still echoing in his ears, Elias realized the truth. The town of Promise Valley, as Silas had called it, was not built on the promise of soil. It was built on the promise of blood. And he and Sarah were no longer just settlers. They were the next honored guests. The horrifying reality of their situation had finally dawned on him. They had stumbled into a town where faith was not in a higher power, but in a horrific cycle of sacrifice and devotion to the very ground they walked on. The night after the harvest festival was a waking nightmare. Elias and Sarah did not sleep. They sat huddled together in the small cabin, the silence outside now a suffocating weight. The town, which had seemed so peaceful and remote, was now a cage. They were trapped, a horrifying realization that settled over them like a thick fog. "We have to leave," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from unspoken terror. "Now, we have to go." Elias shook his head, his mind racing. "Where? We're 2 days from Cedar Rapids, and they'll know we're gone. They'll come after us." He remembered the way Silas's eyes had watched them, a possessive, knowing gaze. There was no escape in the dark. The next morning the town was back to its unsettling routine. Men worked in the fields, women tended to their chores, and the children played their silent games. There was no mention of the prospector. No one spoke of what had happened. It was as if the night's events had been a shared, silent dream. A dream that left a taste of ash in Elias's mouth. Elias spent the day pretending to work, his mind churning with a desperate plan. He knew he had to find out more. He had to understand their twisted logic. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to reason with them, to appeal to a shred of humanity he hoped they still possessed. He saw Silas enter the town hall, the largest of the buildings, which also served as the town's library. It was a place Elias had always wanted to explore. He had seen Silas and a few others going in and out, but he had never been inside himself. Now, driven by a morbid curiosity and a desperate need for answers, he knew he had to go in. Waiting until the coast was clear, Elias slipped out of his cabin and made his way to the town hall. The door creaked open, revealing a room lined with shelves. But the shelves weren't filled with books. They were filled with journals, hundreds of them, bound in leather, their spines marked with names and dates. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and something else, something metallic and rusty. Elias pulled a journal from the shelf. The name on the spine was John Abernathy, 1868. He opened it, his hands trembling. The first page was a diary entry, written in a clear, deliberate hand. It spoke of a group of settlers, led by a man named Alistair, who had come to the valley with a shared, desperate belief. They were a community of outcasts, men and women who had lost everything: their farms, their families, their faith. They had found the valley, and in it, they had found a new, terrible god. The journal described how the land, parched and infertile, had responded to an offering. The offering was a passing trapper, a man who had strayed into their valley. The journal described the ritual with a horrifying lack of emotion, detailing the process of returning his essence to the soil. In the days that followed, the land had flourished. A crop that should have failed had burst forth with an impossible yield. The settlers took it as a sign. A sign that the land was not just land. It was a living, sentient entity that demanded a tribute. A life for a life. A life for the harvest. Elias read on, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The journal detailed the growth of the town, the arrival of more settlers, and the horrifying continuation of the rituals. Each new visitor, each new traveler who stumbled upon their secluded valley, was a new offering. The names on the spines of the journals were the names of the victims. Each book was a testament to a life taken, a library of souls. Elias's eyes scanned the shelves, a new, sickening horror washing over him. He saw names, dates, and he knew he was looking at the town's history. A history of cold-blooded, ritualistic murder. The journal of John Abernathy ended abruptly, his last entry a frantic scrawl. They said I was the next sacrifice. I ran. I tried to warn them. I think I've reached a place. No, they're here. They have Silas. They have him tied up. It's not Silas. It's... The page was torn. The last few lines were missing. Elias's heart pounded in his chest. A terrifying thought formed in his mind. The man they called Silas. Was he a victim too? Had he been forced into this? Was he trying to warn them, like Abernathy? A voice from the doorway made him jump. Looking for something, Elias? It was Silas. He stood in the doorway, his eyes as empty as they had been the first day they arrived. But there was something different in them now. A flicker of something ancient and malevolent, a cold, predatory intelligence. He held a small, leather-bound journal in his hand. "This is the one you should be reading," Silas said, his voice as soft as ever. "It's the latest entry. It's about you." Elias's breath caught in his throat. He looked at the journal in Silas's hand. The spine was new, the leather still supple. It was unmarked, a blank canvas waiting for its story to be told. The final story. His story. "You and your sister have brought us a good harvest, Elias," Silas said, his eyes now glinting with a horrifying kind of hunger. "But the land demands more. It always demands more." He took a step closer. The scent of fresh earth and something else. Something cloying and rotten, filling the small room. Elias stumbled back, knocking a stack of journals from a shelf. They fell to the floor, their spines cracking. A single small journal lay on top of the pile. Its spine was thin, and the name Alistair was carved into the leather. Elias knew with a sickening certainty that this was the founder's journal. The original. The answers he so desperately sought were in that small leather book. The secrets of how this all began, and maybe, just maybe, how it could end. But Silas was blocking the way, his eyes fixed on Elias, a cold, triumphant smile on his lips. Elias's mind raced. Silas was a wall, a terrifying embodiment of the town's madness. But the journal of Alistair, the founder, lay on the floor, a beacon of hope in a sea of despair. If Elias could just reach it, he might find the answers he needed. A way to fight back. A way to save himself and Sarah. "You're not like the others, are you?" Elias asked, his voice shaking, but he forced himself to stand his ground. "You're the one in charge." Silas's smile widened, a chilling, humorless curve of his lips. "I am simply the caretaker. The land is in charge." He took another step, his shadow engulfing Elias. "It whispers to me. It tells me what it needs." Elias lunged. Not at Silas, but past him, towards the stack of journals on the floor. He fumbled with the books, his fingers closing around the thin, worn leather of Alistair's journal. He scrambled back, clutching the book to his chest. Silas didn't move. He simply watched, a flicker of amusement in his empty eyes. "You think a book can save you?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "The past is a finished story, Elias. Your future, however, is yet to be written, and I have the pen." Elias ignored him, his eyes scanning the first page of the journal. The handwriting was neat, but the words were filled with a burning, fanatical belief. Alistair wrote of a great famine that had swept across the land, a drought that had left his family and his community starving. He had wandered for weeks, half mad with hunger, until he stumbled upon the fertile valley. But the land, though rich, would not yield. He had tried everything. Prayer, hard work, sacrifice of his own meager possessions. Nothing. And then, one night, he had heard a voice, a whisper on the wind. It spoke of a contract, a simple exchange, life for life. A promise to be a caretaker, a shepherd of the land, providing it with what it truly needed. He had dismissed it as a hallucination, a figment of his starving mind. But the whisper had grown into a chorus, a collective hum that vibrated in the very soil. Driven by a desperate, maddening hunger, he had made a terrible choice. He had found a lost trapper and had offered him to the land. The next day, the fields had burst forth with an impossible green. The harvest was more bountiful than he could have ever imagined. He had returned to his community, a small group of fellow outcasts and survivors, and told them of his discovery, of the living land and its terrible price. Some had fled in horror, but others, their minds broken by desperation and hunger, had stayed. They had become the first settlers of this cursed town, and they had built a community, a life, on a foundation of ritualistic murder. Elias's eyes scanned the next pages, each one a chronicle of horrifying choices, of justifications for unspeakable acts. But as he read, he noticed something strange. Alistair's handwriting began to change. It became frantic, jagged, filled with a growing sense of panic. "The land demands more," a page read. "The whispers are relentless. It's not enough to give it strangers. It wants one of us." The next entry was a final, horrifying revelation. "They've found me. The whispers, they've turned on me. The land. It doesn't just demand a life, it demands a caretaker, a vessel to hear its call. Silas, my son. He has the gift. The land chose him. It will take my life, but my son, will be its voice." Elias's head snapped up. Silas was not a victim. He was the next generation of this horrifying cult. He had been raised to hear the whispers, to fulfill the land's macabre demands. This wasn't a choice for him. It was an inheritance. His father, Alistair, the founder, had been the first sacrifice, a chilling turn of events that solidified the town's horrifying cycle. Silas, standing before Elias, was not just a murderer. He was a product of this place, a man who had never known a life outside of this twisted, ritualistic existence. His empty eyes, his calm demeanor, his unwavering devotion to the land, it was all a result of a lifetime of conditioning. He was as much a prisoner as Elias, a slave to the whispering soil. Suddenly the air in the library grew thick. The hum Elias had heard during the festival returned, but this time it was louder, more focused. The ground beneath his feet seemed to vibrate. Silas's eyes, once empty, now held a terrifying, almost ecstatic light. He was listening to the land. And its message was clear. "The soil is thirsty, Elias," Silas said, his voice now a low, guttural murmur, a strange echo of the humming in the air. "And you have what it craves. You are the final part of the story, the offering that will make the land stronger than ever before." Elias knew he had to act. He had no choice. He had to fight for his life, for Sarah's life. He had to sever the connection between Silas and the land. He looked at the journal in his hand, then at the man before him. Silas was the key. He was the land's voice, the personification of its malevolent hunger. To stop the whispers, Elias had to stop Silas. The founder's journal held the truth, but it also held a chilling promise. The cycle wouldn't end with Silas. It would simply pass on. Elias knew he couldn't run. He had to break the cycle. He had to stop the whispers from spreading, from claiming another generation. He had to expose the town's macabre secret, even if it cost him his life. The fight for survival had begun. The library, once a place of quiet contemplation, had become a battleground. Silas, eyes wide with a terrifying fanaticism, lunged at Elias. Elias, despite his fear, moved with a speed he didn't know he possessed. He sidestepped the attack, the founder's journal still clutched in his hand. "The land whispers for you, Elias," Silas roared, his voice no longer his own, but a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to emanate from the very earth. "It craves your fear, your life." Elias knew he couldn't outmatch Silas in a physical fight. Silas was stronger and driven by a madness that gave him an inhuman strength. Elias had to use his mind, his knowledge of the town's horrifying secret. The founder, Alistair, had mentioned his own desperate attempts to break the cycle. Elias remembered a passage in the journal, a frantic scrawl about a place where the whispers cannot reach. "You're not Silas," Elias shouted, hoping to pierce the madness. "You're a puppet, a slave to this twisted land." The words seemed to hit a nerve. Silas faltered for a moment, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. Elias used the opening. He threw a stack of journals at Silas, scattering the town's horrific history across the floor. Silas roared in frustration and rage. He was not just Silas. He was the sum of all the sacrifices, all the whispered promises. Elias ran out of the library, the journal of Alistair still in his hand. He had to find that place. He had to find a way to sever the connection between Silas and the land. He sprinted through the town, the quiet streets now feeling like a labyrinth designed to trap him. The townspeople, their faces blank and empty, watched him from the shadows, their silence a chilling condemnation. He saw Sarah standing near their cabin, her face a mask of terror. "Elias, what happened?" she cried. "No time," he gasped. "We have to go. We have to find the place where the whispers can't reach." He led her towards the edge of the clearing, towards a path that led deeper into the woods in the opposite direction of the sacrificial grove. He remembered a passage from the journal. Alistair had built a hidden structure, a place of his own making, a refuge for his soul where he had tried to escape the whispers. A place where the soil was barren, untouched, and unhearing. As they ran, the hum grew louder, a thrumming in the air that seemed to shake the very leaves on the trees. Silas was close behind them. His guttural roars echoed through the forest. The townspeople, like silent predatory birds, began to follow, their footsteps a soft, rustling sound in the undergrowth. Elias and Sarah ran until their lungs burned, until their muscles screamed in protest. They came to a small, hidden cave nestled behind a curtain of thick vines. It was a natural formation, a small, dark crevice in the earth. Elias pushed the vines aside, revealing a small, dry and barren interior. The ground was rocky, devoid of any soil. This was it. the place where the whispers cannot reach. They scrambled inside just as Silas burst from the trees, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He saw them, but as he stepped toward the cave, he stopped. The hum around him seemed to falter, to weaken. His eyes, so full of malevolent light moments ago, now held a look of pained confusion. The whispers. "They're gone," he mumbled, his voice returning to its normal human tone. "I can't hear them." Elias, from the safety of the cave, looked at Silas, a flicker of pity in his heart. The man standing before him was not a monster. He was a victim. A man who had been a slave to a monstrous belief his entire life. The whispers were his reality, his God. Without them, he was lost. But Silas's moment of lucidity was fleeting. The hum returned, not from the earth, but from the townspeople who had gathered behind him, their silent forms a terrifying phalanx. They began to chant, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to fuel Silas's power. Their collective belief, their shared madness, was enough to sustain the connection. Silas's eyes hardened, and the malevolent light returned. He was no longer just the caretaker of the land. He was a conduit for the town's collective hunger. He was a representation of the madness that had consumed them all. "The whispers will find you, Elias," he said, his voice now a terrible, echoing whisper. "They will find you. The land. It is everywhere." He took a step towards the cave, his hand outstretched, his fingers twitching with a horrifying hunger. Elias knew he had to end it, not just for himself and Sarah, but for all the future victims, for all the past ones. He had to break the cycle. He had to unmake the town. He looked at Sarah, a silent understanding passing between them. They had to destroy the source of the whispers, the very belief that fueled the town's horror. They had to expose the macabre secret to the outside world, to bring the truth to light. The fight for survival had escalated. It was no longer about escape. It was about justice. It was about exposing the town's horrific truth and ensuring that no one else would ever fall prey to the settlers who built a macabre town with no church. The cave was a temporary sanctuary, a brief respite from the horrifying reality just outside. Elias and Sarah watched from the dark as Silas stood before them, his face a mask of rage and confusion. The rhythmic chanting of the townspeople grew in intensity, a chilling chorus that seemed to vibrate with a terrible energy. "The land will have you, Elias," Silas screamed, his voice raw with a desperate fury. "It demands its tribute. It demands its voice." But Elias, from the safety of the cave, saw the truth. Silas was not a god. He was a pawn. The whispers weren't a divine call. They were a collective delusion, a madness passed down from one generation to the next. The townspeople's belief, their unwavering faith in the living land, was the true source of the power. They were the ones who fueled the whispers, who gave them substance. Elias knew he had to break that faith. He had to shatter their belief system. And the only way to do that was to expose their secret, to bring the truth to light. They couldn't hide in the cave forever. The townspeople would simply wait them out. "Silas," Elias called out, his voice strong and clear, "your father, Alistair, tried to escape. He tried to end it. He built this place to get away from the whispers. He was a victim, just like you." Silas faltered, his eyes wide with a flicker of doubt. The chanting of the townspeople wavered for a moment. But then a woman, her face twisted with a fanatical zeal, stepped forward. "Blasphemy!" she shrieked. "He lies! He is a denier of the soil! The land will feast on his soul!" The others echoed her, their voices a rising tide of fury. The collective madness was too strong. It washed over Silas, extinguishing the brief moment of lucidity. His eyes hardened once more, and he lunged at the entrance of the cave, his hands clawing at the rocky walls. Elias knew it was useless to argue. He had to act. He turned to Sarah. "We have to go back to town," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We have to find the railroad foreman's records. They're in the town hall. They have a list of all the settlers who came here, a list of all the victims." "What?" Sarah's eyes were wide with disbelief. "Why? They'll kill us. We have to get the proof," Elias said, his voice filled with a grim determination. "We have to get the names of the people they've murdered. We have to take it to the authorities, to the outside world. This isn't about just surviving anymore, Sarah. This is about exposing them, ending it for good." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded, a resolute look on her face. She was no longer the frightened, trembling woman she had been. The terror had been replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. They had nothing left to lose. They waited until nightfall. The townspeople, seemingly content to wait for them to emerge, had set up a campfire just outside the cave's entrance. Their chanting had faded into a low, hypnotic hum. Elias and Sarah, their movements silent, slipped out of the back of the cave into the dense, dark woods. They moved like ghosts, their hearts pounding in their chests. The forest, which had seemed so beautiful and wild on their journey here, now felt like a living thing, its branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to grab them. They could feel the town's presence, its silent, watchful eye, even from a distance. As they reached the edge of the clearing, they saw a sight that made their blood run cold. Another wagon, another family, a husband, a wife, and 2 small children. They were being led into town by a group of smiling, welcoming townspeople. The family looked tired but relieved. They had found a new home. They had no idea they had just walked into a tomb. Elias's resolve hardened. He had to do this. He had to save them. He and Sarah crept to the town hall, the Library of Souls. The door was unlocked. Elias slipped inside, his hands fumbling for the foreman's records, a stack of ledgers kept in a small locked box. He knew the location from Alistair's journal. The lock was simple. He broke it with a rock. He found the ledgers, and his heart sank. The first few pages contained the names of the original settlers. But then, there were pages and pages of names, each one marked with a date of arrival and a chilling final entry. Returned to the soil. John Abernathy, the trapper, the prospector, and now the latest family. He had to get this to the authorities. He had to get it out. He heard a sound outside. Footsteps. Voices. They were coming back. He had to go. He grabbed the ledgers, and he and Sarah slipped out a back window, disappearing into the dark. As they ran, the hum began again. Louder this time. It wasn't coming from the town. It was coming from the woods. From the soil beneath their feet. The land had not given up its hold. The whispers were still there, and they were stronger than ever. They were no longer just chasing Elias and Sarah. They were calling out for a new sacrifice. And Elias knew with a horrifying certainty that they wouldn't stop until they had their due. The hum followed them. It was a low, resonant thrum that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath their feet, a sound that Elias now associated with pure, unadulterated malevolence. He and Sarah ran, the heavy ledgers clutched in Elias's arms, the pages filled with the grim history of the town. They ran for what felt like hours, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, the cold Iowa air burning their lungs. The forest around them was a living entity, its gnarled trees and thick undergrowth a terrifying maze. They could hear sounds in the distance, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, and they knew they were being pursued. Not by one person, but by the entire town, a silent, terrifying mob. "Elias," Sarah gasped, her voice raw with exhaustion. "We're going in circles, the whispers. They're confusing us." Elias looked around. The moon, a thin sliver of white in a bruised sky, cast long, distorted shadows. The trees all looked the same. The ground was littered with broken branches and dried leaves. It was true. The whispers, a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration in the air, were disorienting them, playing tricks on their minds. It was as if the land itself was trying to stop them, to turn them back. "We have to find the railroad tracks," Elias said, his voice filled with a desperate urgency. "That's the only way out. That's the only way to get this to civilization." They changed direction, fighting their way through the tangled undergrowth. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from all directions, a cacophony of distorted, angry voices. They heard their names being called, distorted and drawn out, like a mournful wail. Elias. Sarah. They came to a small clearing. In the center, a circle of stones lay on the ground, a makeshift fire pit. The embers of a recent fire still glowed faintly. Elias looked at them, a sense of dread washing over him. The townspeople were close, very close. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the trees. "Elias, Sarah, over here." It was Silas, but his voice was different. It was filled with a desperate, pleading urgency. Elias and Sarah, their minds clouded by fear and exhaustion, faltered. Was it a trick? Or was it the real Silas, the man who had been a victim his entire life, trying to help them? They looked at each other, a silent debate passing between them. "We have to risk it," Elias whispered. "It might be our only chance." They ran towards the voice. They found Silas standing by a large, gnarled oak tree. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He was no longer the imposing, fanatical figure they had known. He was a terrified man, a slave who had just woken up to the horrors of his master. I can't do it anymore," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The land, it's going to swallow me whole. It's demanding something new, something I can't give." "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. It wants me to give it to... I can't say it. It's too horrible." He shook his head, a single solitary tear tracing a path down his dust-caked face. "They're coming. The town. They're no longer people. They're the land's will. Its hands and feet." And then they heard it. A rustling in the trees, a slow, deliberate cracking of branches. It was the townspeople. A dark, silent army, their eyes glinting in the faint moonlight. They weren't running. They were walking, with a terrifying, patient and unhurried certainty. "The railroad tracks are that way," Silas said, pointing with a trembling hand. "A few miles. There's a river. If you can cross it. The land's hold is weak there." He looked at them, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Get out of here, please, for the love of God." Elias and Sarah didn't hesitate. They ran. They didn't look back. They ran towards the river, towards the promise of escape. They could hear the sounds of the townspeople getting closer, a chilling, rhythmic chant. But they were no longer just calling out to Elias and Sarah. They were calling out to Silas. A new sacrifice had been found. A new honored guest. As they reached the river's edge, they heard Silas scream. A short, sharp, terrifying sound that was cut off abruptly. Silence. The chanting stopped. The hum of the whispers faded. Elias and Sarah, their hearts pounding in their chests, scrambled across the shallow river, their boots sinking in the muddy water. They reached the other side, and the air around them felt clean. The whispers were gone. The oppressive feeling of being watched, of being hunted, had vanished. They were free. They made it to the railroad tracks, exhausted but alive. They had the ledgers, they had the proof. But they had left a good man behind. A man who had finally found the strength to fight back, only to be swallowed by the same evil he had served his entire life. They had a chilling sense of dread, of a debt unpaid. They would expose the town's secret. They would ensure that no one else would ever fall prey to this horrific cult. But they knew, with a certainty that settled deep in their bones, that the town would go on. The land would find a new voice, a new caretaker, and the cycle would continue. The terror was not over. It was just beginning. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. For more terrifying stories, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next installment. The journey to Cedar Rapids was a long, harrowing ordeal. Elias and Sarah, their clothes torn and their bodies bruised, followed the railroad tracks like a lifeline. The ledgers, their precious cargo, were a heavy weight in Elias's arms, a testament to the horrors they had witnessed. They were no longer just survivors. They were witnesses. They walked for 2 days, fueled by a grim determination and the last of their meager rations. The terror of the valley had been replaced by a gnawing fear of the unknown. They knew the town would not just let them go. The land, with its insatiable hunger, would demand a price for their freedom. On the morning of the 3rd day, as the sun rose over the rolling hills, they saw the first sign of civilization, a small train station in the distance. Relief, hot and stinging, welled up in their eyes. They were safe. They were free. They stumbled into the station, their appearance drawing stares and whispers. They looked like ghosts, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow with a fear that went beyond exhaustion. Elias approached the station master, a kind-faced man with a thick, bushy mustache. "We need to report a crime," Elias said, his voice raspy. "A town, out west. They're murdering people." The station master's face, initially one of concern, shifted to one of skepticism. "Murdering people? Son, you've been out in the sun too long. This is Iowa. Nothing like that happens here." Elias, with a frantic urgency, opened the ledgers. He showed the station master the names, the dates, the chilling final entry. "Return to the soil." The station master's eyes widened. He saw the prospector's name, a man he had seen just a few weeks ago, a man who had spoken of striking it rich in the Western Territories. The station master, a man of simple faith and a deep respect for the law, was shaken. He sent a telegram to the local sheriff, and within a few hours, a stern-faced, no-nonsense man named Sheriff Brody arrived. Sheriff Brody listened to their story with a stony face, his eyes fixed on Elias and Sarah. He was a man who had seen his share of liars and half-crazed drifters, but he also knew a genuine account when he heard one. The fear in their eyes was real. The ledgers were real. "I'll need a posse," Sheriff Brody said, his voice a low rumble, a strong one. "These people, they sound dangerous. And if what you say is true, they're not just murderers. They're something else." Elias and Sarah, despite their exhaustion, felt a surge of hope. Justice. It was finally within their grasp. They had risked everything, and it had paid off. Sheriff Brody gathered a group of 6 armed men, rugged and experienced frontiersmen. He asked Elias and Sarah to lead the way, to show them the path to the valley. Elias, with a grim determination, agreed. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. He wanted to see justice served. The journey back was filled with a nervous energy. The posse was quiet, their faces grim, their hands resting on the butts of their rifles. Elias and Sarah, however, were filled with a strange sense of vindication. They were no longer running. They were coming back. As they drew closer to the valley, the air began to change. The normal, fresh scent of the pines was replaced by a cloying, earthy odor. A low hum, a subtle vibration in the air began to make itself known. The men of the posse, men who were hardened by years on the frontier, began to look at each other, their faces filled with unease. "What is that sound?" one of them whispered, his hand tightening on his rifle. "The whispers," Elias said, his voice a low whisper. "They're back." They came to the clearing and found the town in a state of grim, silent anticipation. The townspeople were gathered in the center, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on a single spot. Sheriff Brody, a man of action, rode forward, his hand on his revolver. "I'm Sheriff Brody," he announced, his voice echoing in the unnerving silence. "We have reason to believe this town is involved in criminal activity. I have arrest warrants for every one of you." Silas emerged from the crowd, his face a mask of weary defiance. "There is no crime here, Sheriff," he said, his voice filled with a strange, sorrowful certainty. "There is only devotion." But as he spoke, Elias saw something that made his blood run cold. In the center of the clearing, a makeshift pyre was being built, and on it, a terrified young couple, the new settlers, were bound, their eyes wide with a horrifying understanding of their fate. The townspeople were getting ready for a new sacrifice. The land was demanding its due. Elias, with a horrified certainty, realized the truth. The townspeople weren't just a cult. They were a living organism, and the price of their freedom was another's life. They had escaped, and the land, with its terrifying logic, had simply found a new vessel, a new, honored guest. The horror was not over. It was just beginning. The final act was upon them. The air hung thick with a palpable tension. Sheriff Brody and his posse, their rifles at the ready, stood in a tight formation, their faces grim. The townspeople, a silent and unblinking crowd, were a terrifying mirror image, their hands resting on scythes and pitchforks, their eyes filled with a cold, unyielding fire. At the center of it all, the young couple, their faces pale with terror, were tied to the pyre. "Lower your weapons," Sheriff Brody commanded, his voice a low, authoritative rumble. "And release the prisoners. Now." Silas, his face a mask of sorrowful resolve, shook his head. "We can't," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The land. It demands a new offering. We have to keep the cycle going." "There is no land," Sheriff Brody said, his voice filled with a righteous anger. "There is only murder, and I will not stand by and let you get away with it." As if on cue, a low, guttural hum began to emanate from the ground. The posse members, their faces filled with confusion and unease, shifted their weight, their eyes darting around in search of the source of the sound. The townspeople, however, stood perfectly still, their faces filled with a serene, almost ecstatic reverence. Elias knew what was happening. The townspeople were using their collective belief, their shared madness, to fuel the whispers, to give the land a voice. It was a terrifying, communal delusion, one that had been passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter. Elias had to do something. He had to break the cycle. He had to shatter their belief system. He had to give them a reason to doubt. He ran forward right into the middle of the standoff, the ledgers held high above his head. "This is not devotion," he screamed, his voice raw with emotion. "This is not faith. This is a lie. Alistair, the founder, he wasn't a prophet. He was a desperate man who fell for a trick. He was a man who tried to escape this very curse. He was the first sacrifice." The townspeople faltered. The hum wavered. A few of them, their eyes filled with a flicker of doubt, looked at Silas. Silas's face for the first time was filled with a deep, profound confusion. His father, the man he had revered, the man he had been told was a prophet, was a victim. The whispers for a moment were silent. Elias had found the weakness, the truth. He had to press it. "Silas, your father wrote this himself," he said, his voice ringing out in the sudden silence. "He wrote of how he tried to escape. He wrote of how he was betrayed. This isn't your destiny, Silas, it's your prison." Silas, his eyes wide, looked at the ledgers in Elias's hands, then at the terrified young couple tied to the pyre. He saw his own reflection in their eyes, the fear, the desperation. He saw his own life, a terrible pre-written tragedy. "No," he whispered, a single word that carried a world of pain and sorrow. "No more." With a sudden, defiant roar, Silas plunged a hand into his pocket and pulled out a small metallic object. A compass. He had been carrying it since he was a boy, a gift from his father, Alistair. It was the only thing Alistair had left him, a testament to his love. Silas had never understood its significance until now. Alistair had been a prospector, a man who believed in maps and directions, not whispers and sacrifice. It was a silent, final defiance, a way to prove that he was still a man and not a monster. And then, with a terrible, desperate cry, Silas hurled the compass at the pyre, right at the thick rope that bound the young man. The metal, sharp and heavy, sliced through the rope. The young man fell, his hands free. The young woman was still bound, but the balance of the pyre had been broken. The structure began to teeter. The townspeople, their minds reeling from the sudden defiant act, screamed. The collective hum, the source of their power, was shattered. The whispers, for the first time, were silent. "Now!" Elias screamed. "Sheriff, now!" Sheriff Brody, a man who had been waiting for a sign, took it. He raised his rifle and fired. The shot, a loud, ear-shattering crack, echoed through the valley. It wasn't a shot at the townspeople, it was a shot at a target, a symbol. The shot hit the rope that bound the young woman. She was free. The young couple scrambled off the pyre, their legs wobbly, their eyes wide with relief. The townspeople, their belief system shattered, were a mob of confused, terrified individuals. Their strength was in their collective delusion. Without it, they were just farmers, housewives, and children. Just people. The posse, their faces now grimly resolute, moved in. The townspeople, their eyes now empty of their terrifying zeal, scattered.
Silas stood alone in the center of the clearing, his eyes filled with a quiet despair. He had broken the cycle, but in doing so he had become an outcast, a betrayer. He had lost everything, his family, his home, his life. He was a man who
had finally found his soul, only to be left with the terrible emptiness of his existence. The town of Promise Valley was finished. The cycle had been broken. The whispers were silent. But Elias knew with a horrifying certainty that the story was not over. The land was still there. It was still hungry. And it would wait. It would wait for a new generation, a new group of desperate people, and a new caretaker to hear its call. The horror was over for now, but the soil, it had a long memory. The aftermath was a somber, silent affair. Sheriff Brody and his men arrested every member of the town. They were taken away, their faces blank and unreadable, their once fierce eyes now filled with a bewildered emptiness. They had lost their God, their purpose. They were just ordinary people, with an extraordinary and horrifying secret. Elias and Sarah stayed behind, their hearts heavy with a mixture of relief and sorrow. The young couple, their saviors, thanked them with tears in their eyes. They, along with the posse, left the valley, leaving Elias and Sarah alone to face the silent, empty town. Elias walked through the streets, the silence a heavy weight on his shoulders. He saw the cabins, the general store, the town hall, the town that had been built on a lie, on blood. He walked to the place where the pyre had stood, the ground scorched and scarred. There was a new stillness in the air, a different kind of silence. Not the hungry, watchful quiet of before, but a profound, almost peaceful silence. The whispers were gone. For now. He found Silas by a large, gnarled oak tree, the one where he had met him for the last time. Silas was sitting on the ground, his back against the tree, his head bowed. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a long, terrible dream. "They're gone," Elias said, his voice soft. "All of them." Silas didn't look up. "I know," he said, his voice a hollow echo. "I'm the only one left, the last one, the last caretaker." Elias sat down beside him. "You did the right thing, Silas," he said. "You broke the cycle. You saved them." Silas let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Did I? I betrayed my family, my people, My entire life. I was born into this. It was all I ever knew. I was the voice of the land. Now I'm just a man who has nothing at all. He was right. He had lost everything. He had traded a terrifying purpose for a crushing emptiness. He had broken free from his prison, but he had been left with nothing to fill the void. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the small compass, the one that had belonged to Alistair. He held it out to Silas. "Your father gave this to you for a reason, Silas," he said. "He wanted you to be free. He wanted you to find your own way, to be your own man. This is your new purpose, to live a life that is truly yours." Silas took the compass, his fingers tracing the worn brass. A single tear, hot and stinging, fell on the glass. He looked at Elias, a flicker of something in his eyes, a raw, unadulterated hope. He had a choice now. He could live the life his father had wanted for him, a life of his own making, a life of purpose. But as Elias and Sarah prepared to leave the valley, a chilling thought settled in Elias's mind. The town was empty. The people were gone. The whispers were silent. But the land, the soil, it was still there, waiting. It was a silent, unblinking entity that had fed on human sacrifice for generations. It had been defeated, but it had not been destroyed. It would wait for a new group of desperate people, a new desperate soul who would listen to its terrible silent whispers. Elias and Sarah left the valley, the ledgers in their possession, their hearts filled with the grim knowledge of what had transpired. They would tell their story. They would warn people. But they knew with a certainty that settled deep in their bones that some stories were too terrible to believe, and some whispers, even when silent, would never truly die. The horror was over. The town was empty, but the land would always remember. It would always be hungry. The settlers who built a macabre town with no church were not the monsters. The soil was the monster, and the soil would always find a way to feed. The story had come to an end, but the chilling truth of the valley would live on. The terror, as they knew it, was over. But the legacy of the town and its silent, unblinking earth would haunt them forever.